Good afternoon and welcome to the Daily Journal's Capitol View webcast. I'm your host, Chris Kiefer, managing editor for multimedia here at the Northeast Mississippi Daily Journal. And as always, we are joined live from Jackson by Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison to talk about the latest in state politics. This week we've got, I would say, the busiest topic, the most buzz has been about the school funding rewrite. That's a topic that came up a lot last year. I guess that was probably one of the biggest topics going into last legislative session, and maybe one of the stories of the 2017 session was that nothing happened, and they couldn't really get a consensus for it. And I guess, as Bobby, as we've kind of talked in the lead up to this year, there was a lot of buzz, again, that it was going to be discussed this year, but there were really few details, and so it's kind of hard to know what was really going to happen. But I guess that effort has really picked up steam over the last couple of days, huh?
Yeah, the House leadership has put this issue on the fast track, if you will. Matter of fact, Chris, the House Appropriations Committee met this morning. Sort of a picturesque setting. You can see the outside of the House Appropriations Committee room. You can see the snow falling, and there's not a lot of people in the Capitol, but they met and voted to pass the new funding formula out of the Appropriations Committee, and it could be voted on by the full House as early as Wednesday, and then it will presumably head to the Senate, where the Senate will take it up, and so it's the leadership it appears leadership on the House and Senate side and the governor are dead set on passing this legislation during the 2018 session.
I guess one of the key figures right now in it is Richard Bennett. Did I get his first name right?
Right, he's the new House
Education chair, who I guess before he was in that position, when he was the gaming chair, last year, the Speaker Phil Gunn had kind of made him his head lieutenant on this issue, and then just about a week or two ago moved him into the education chair position, and it seems like in that position he's really kind of using his leverage. Seems to be a big issue that he's kind of behind.
Yeah, I don't know if it's such a big issue for him though, Chris, as it is for the leadership of Philip Gunn and Speaker Philip Gunn, Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves, and Governor Phil Bryant. I mean, I think they're really the ones pushing this issue. And of course, the effort is to rewrite the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, which is a mechanism used to provide state funding in local school districts. Essentially, through the years, the Republican leadership has felt that the MAEP funding formula has produced too much money for education. They have not funded it, and now they want to rewrite it so they can get it off the books and not have to deal with it any longer.
Yeah, and so I guess it kind of came up. We've talked before. There really weren't a lot of details. I guess last week, EdBuild, which is the New Jersey firm that Speaker Philip Gunn, Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves contracted with in October 2016 to help with this effort, they had come back to the legislature and I guess presented some details of what this might look like. But I get the impression, at least from your stories, that there's still a lot of questions and unknowns about how the new formula would be. Kind of tell us more about that, or have some of the questions been answered, or kind of what is the general feel now?
Yeah, the plan, Chris, is now that, EdBuild kind of came up with this concept, but they're kind of cherry picking the EdBuild recommendations they use. They're leaving out some of the key EdBuild recommendations that would impact negatively in a negative manner the more affluent school districts. They're leaving that recommendation out of the EdBuild proposal. But essentially what the House bill would do is, over a 7-year period, phase in this new funding formula, and it would produce over that period as much as $110 million more for public education than they got this year. Now, it's important to understand that would not be a large increase when you consider the size of the state money going. The amount of it's over $2 billion going to from the state to local school districts. So that would not be a lot of money, and it would be, and especially when you take into account for the current school year, MAEP was underfunded $213 million, so it would not produce as much money as the MAEP funding formula would produce for public education if it was fully funded. Essentially, what this funding formula does is it sets a base student cost, and it's based on some criteria set forth by Ed Bill, but it's $4,800, and then they would add what they call add-ons or multipliers for, you'd get additional money for poor students. I think it's additional 25% for poor students. You get additional money for special needs students, for English as second learner students, even more money for high school. For going to high school students would get a multiplier and add-on. And that's but you would start with that base student cost of $4,800. And a lot of people who are concerned about the formula are concerned, A, it doesn't produce as much money as MAEP, and B, there's not a growth factor in the formula. It would essentially, they feel that the legislature would have the discretion to determine what that base student cost would be, and there might be a propensity to lower in certain years. Now with MAEP, it was sort of objective. It was based on objective parameters, and you can argue about whether those were the right parameters or not. But you essentially took C-level schools, that were officially run C-level schools, and determined how much it cost to educate students in those school districts. And the school district got that amount of money, times their average daily attendance. So it's a change in the way that the school districts are funded. And, it's obvious that the leadership has felt that the MAEP has created headaches and heartaches because of, their unsuccessful efforts, or I don't know if there was even say it was efforts, because it hasn't been fully funded. That some people have criticized that, and so they want a new funding formula that'd be easier to fully fund, and they'll have more discretion on what full funding looks like.
Sure. So the issue, it passed, you mentioned this morning, through the House Education Committee. Was there much debate there, and what are you expecting? When do you think it'll come to the floor, and kind of how do you expect that'll go?
I think it'll come to the floor tomorrow, actually, on Wednesday, and I think it'll pass along party line votes. I think the House leadership, Republican leadership, has exerted a lot of energy to pass this year, and it's a priority for them. And I think that there'll be few, if any, members who go against the leadership on this issue. In the committee room, there was an effort to delay the enactment for a couple of years, and that was by the Democrats, and that was defeated. It's kind of unusual the way they're doing this. They're phasing it over 7 years, and it goes into effect. The first year, on July 1st, it goes into effect. But by the same token, most districts are held harmless for the first 2 years. So without getting into many details, school districts aren't going to receive much more or much less money than they received during this current school year. Essentially, they'll receive the same level of funding for 2 years. And during that time, Richard Bennett, the Education Committee chair, says, points out there's the bill enacting this new formula sets up several study committees to look at different issues that they might need to address before it goes into full effect in 3 years. So essentially, they're saying we're passing this bill, but we're going to study it for a couple of years to see if we need to make additional changes, which is kind of a different way to do things. But that's what they've chosen to do with this particular piece of legislation, which, Chris, this is, we shouldn't, you cannot underscore how important this is. This produces the largest single amount of state money going to, to any agency or entity in state government. Is a huge piece of the state, state revenue. Everybody agrees schools are important, and this is the state money that goes to run those schools. So this is an important issue, and it's and some people feel it's that it's not being studied and looked at as much as it should be. The Republican leadership would say, well, we started this process in 2016. Why it has not always been done, in the full light of day, if you will. They say they've been working on it a long time, and they're ready to move forward.
Yeah, and it's obviously a highly partisan issue too. You mentioned that in the House you're expecting the vote to go down party lines. But I guess it's become an issue in elections, and I guess even just in general election years of maybe where the Republican leadership has maybe received more criticism than other issues is on that MAEP. And you always hear, in election years, I guess, that the criticism towards from some circles towards the Republican candidates is over the MAEP or the failure to fund it, because it's only been funded, is it 2 times, since it's been fully enacted. I guess it was passed in 97 and fully enacted in the early 2000s.
And 2003 was the first year first year of full implementation, and it was fully funded that year, and again in 2007, which also was an election year. Mm-hmm. But and 2007 was a ways back now, but you go back and look at the history of MAP. And in 2006, Chris, there was legislation passed, pushed by Republican Governor Phil Bryant, House Speaker Philip Gunn, others saying that they were going to phase in full funding, and after that it would be fully funded. It would not be an issue again. Haley Barbour, Phil Bryant, who was running for lieutenant governor at the time, campaigned on the issue that they were going to fully fund MAP, and it wouldn't be an issue again whether MAP was going to receive full funding. They pledged that it would, and then the Great Recession hit a couple of years later, and they lost. They didn't fully fund it during those years, and since then they hadn't fully funded it. Percy Watson, the Democrat from Hattiesburg, pointed out this today in the House Appropriations Committee. That there's probably had been an opportunity to fully fund it in the past few years, except for the fact that, he pointed out that, numerous tax cuts have been enacted that have taken, hundreds of millions of dollars out of the revenue stream. And if those tax cuts hadn't been enacted, there would have been money to fully fund MAP in recent years. But the majority legislature decided to go a different way and enact those tax cuts.
Yeah, and back to the politics behind it too. I think, was it the State of the State speech? I remember reading in one of your articles recently, but I'm thinking it was maybe Bryant in his State of the State speech saying that in supporting the rewrite, saying that this will take off the bill, more or less. Kind of help me with the wording, but the ability to criticize lawmakers for not fully funding education.
That's right. Yeah, they said it'd take away that issue that he said that lawmakers and politicians have been criticized for not fully funding MAEP. Has become election issues, and if MAEP is taken off the books, then that can't be used as a wedge issue, if you will, to criticize some candidates for not voting to fully fund MAEP. Yeah, he said that at the State of the State back last week. Mm-hmm. Also in that same story, I had a quote from him during the 2007 campaign, where I think it was in DeSoto County, speaking to in a campaign event. He said that he fully supported MAP full funding, and while he was lieutenant governor, it would be fully funded. Of course, no year during his term as lieutenant governor wasn't fully funded, but that, as I talked about, that was kind of during the Great Depression. So, the Great Recession. So that made it harder to do.
Yeah, obviously, Governor Bryant, Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves, Speaker of the House, Phil Gunn have all been in lockstep on this issue. But the latest effort, I guess, is a bill written by Gunn coming through the House. The Senate hasn't actually done anything yet this session on it. Do you expect them to more or less kind of take that same bill and run with it, or do you think that there will be some disagreements that are going to have to be worked out?
Well, I think they'll take that bill, and you can take, there still can be some disagreements, but I think my guess is they're going to work off that bill. They may put their own language in that bill. I guess the key question, or the big question for me moving forward, Chris, is when this bill, as I assume it's going to pass the House as early as tomorrow, or sometime soon, if not tomorrow, and it goes to the Senate, will the Senate change the bill, or will the Senate just attempt to pass the House bill as is and send it straight to the governor? Is it on that faster track? That's a key question that we should be looking for. In the coming days, when MAEP was passed in '97, it was a couple-year process, and when they actually got to the end, there was a House version and a Senate version, and they spent literally days and hours worked through a Easter break. I remember in conference, House and Senate negotiators to hammer out the final deal. Now, would there be a conference committee like that with with this rewrite, or will it be just Senate taking the House bill and sending it straight to the governor? That'd be an interesting question to watch for as we move forward.
Sure. Switching gears a little bit, Bobby, I guess another major issue of this session that we've talked about a lot is transportation and finding money for infrastructure improvements. I guess kind of what's been the latest over the last week. I think maybe the one story within the last week I think that you had on it was an effort in the House, which is kind of where right now more of the efforts are coming, that would have diverted some money from the use tax to local governments to be able to use for road and bridge repairs. What's the status of that, and kind of what else has kind of been going on lately on that issue?
Oh, that's the primary legislation now. I mean, it's a significant piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. It diverts a portion of the use tax revenue the state collects and sends it to the cities and the counties for their needs, for their roads and bridge needs. And essentially, it's going to take about $110 million out of the state general fund, it looks like. So that would be that'd be a big boon for the local governments, for the cities and counties. But if you take $110 million out of the state general fund, starting on July 1st, that's going to be a pretty big hole that the legislature has to deal with filling. We talked about those tax cuts and the hundreds of millions of dollars that were taken out of the general fund by those tax cuts. This would also be a significant hit to the general fund. So that bill has passed the House without a dissenting vote. It was 118-0, I believe. And that goes to the Senate, and we'll see what the Senate's going to do with it. Whether the Senate's going to agree to take that money out of the general fund, or say, hold on just a second, we need that money to fund the education that we've been talking about here, Chris, for the past 10 minutes or so. We need it for mental health and for so many other things. Or are they going to give it to the cities and counties? That's a huge issue going forward.
And an interesting wrinkle that you also wrote about it is this whole deal with Amazon, which, if this money is coming from the use tax, I guess a lot of the money in the use tax came from when Amazon started voluntarily collecting the 7% tax on items bought by Mississippians through Amazon. That's obviously such a large portion of online retail. And however, now that Amazon has a brick and mortar presence in Mississippi because of their purchase of Whole Foods, that money won't necessarily go into this fund, correct?
Yeah, that's a huge issue, and we're still trying to figure out how that's going to affect. That could reduce that $110 million we talked about if it's not, if Amazon is forced to mandatory collect that tax, because they do have a brick and mortar presence in the state now, in the forms, Amazon purchased the grocery store at Whole Foods, which has a location in Jackson. So that gives them a brick and mortar presence in the state. If they're forced to collect that money, is that count as use tax anymore? Is that sales tax? And if that's so, then that would take it, put it in a different pile of money, and then it wouldn't be eligible to go to the cities and counties in the way we talked about. So I mean, as we work through these bills dealing with transportation and use tax and sales tax, there's several issues that's got to be worked out. So and we just have to see how that plays out as the session progresses.
Bobby, one more topic before I let you go. We talked at the very top. Governor Phil Bryant had his State of the State speech on, I believe it was Tuesday, but it was last week. It was since our last recording.
Yeah, a long time ago.
yeah, right. So much has happened since. Yeah. Anything, Bobby, from that, looking back at it, that stood out to you about it?
No, he touched sort of, I think I said, familiar themes. He talked about the school funding formula. He talked about putting the emphasis on community colleges for workforce training. He talked about school choice. He talked about making some changes to Medicaid, maybe putting in a work requirement for some Medicaid recipients. But those are all issues he's been talking about for a while. He didn't really hit any new themes. What maybe stuck out as much as anything is he spent a considerable amount of time during his speech. The speech lasted about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and a good 10, 15 minutes of it were spent talking about how things were not as bad as being portrayed by the news media. That the revenue, while it is down, and while state hasn't grown much. He was pointed out that the employment is better. He tried to accentuate the positives instead of talking about the negatives, and so that was a considerable amount of time in his speech.
Sure. Bobby, one thing I thought of, and going back to the first topic on the school funding rewrite, I guess an important topic I want to make sure I understand. I know you've kind of written about, but I guess one thing that as they work through the process, there's still no real comparison of the new formula and the old formula district by district. Is that right? There was maybe some information put out by LBuild last week that people thought it was going to be that way, but it's really a lot more complex than that, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's there's a comparison of what the schools got in through MAEP, what the schools got this school year compared to what they're projected to get in 7 years. That's the only comparison, but even that is confusing because it's not clear that some of that money in that comparison is not money that the schools were already getting, but they just weren't getting it as part of the MAEP funding formula. They were getting it outside that funding formula. So, so while they're saying it's going to be $107 million in new money in 7 years, there's still a question about whether that's actually new money or just money they're putting into a school funding formula that was not in the school funding formula before, but the schools were still getting the money. There's a lot of unanswered questions, and I hadn't written about this, Chris. What has struck me about this whole process is the State Department of Education, which understands those numbers better than any other entity. I mean, by far, they've not been involved in this rewrite effort to any, at least visibly, not much at all. So it seems that at some point, legislators need to get some more information from the State Department of Education to have a firmer grasp of what they're actually doing in this process, because it's such an important process. You're dealing with, money to turn on the lights in the schools for, pay the teacher, turn the lights, clean the buildings. I mean, this is money that the schools have to operate. So we need to have all the facts and figures and understand this, frontwards and backwards as you go forward.
Sure. Yeah, there are a lot of questions that still remain to be answered, I guess, as the process goes on. I know you'll be following that and covering it, and you can catch Bobby's coverage at djournal.com and in the Daily Journal each day. And I know that there will be a lot of it. So that does it for another episode of Capitol View. We thank everyone for watching us again this week, and we remind you can catch us each week, usually on Mondays at 2:00. Sometimes we've got to change based on schedules. But look for us at djournal.com, and you can also find a replay there or on the Daily Journal Facebook page. So again, Bobby, we thank you for joining us, and tell everyone to stay warm best you can, and we will see you next week.
Yeah, stay warm up in Tupelo too. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.